The question hung in the salt-laced air of the Doge's private audience chamber, as sharp and cold as the winter wind whipping through Venice's labyrinthine canals. Can one man's words truly reshape the known world, or merely entertain it with fables? Doge Giovanni Soranzo, his face a roadmap of 80 years etched by diplomacy and doubt, peered at the man before him. Alessandro Querini, barely 30, stood with the quiet intensity of a scholar who had glimpsed something profound and was now burdened with its articulation. His tunic, though of good Venetian wool, was travel-stained, his dark hair unruly, and his eyes held the faraway look of one who had seen wonders, or perhaps endured horrors. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of strange spices and something akin to sun-baked earth clung to him, a ghost of the lands he claimed to have traversed. "Your father, the esteemed Niccolo Querini, and your uncle Matteo," the Doge continued, his voice raspy, "returned from the distant lands of the great Khan with tales that strained credulity. Gold beyond measure, cities vaster than Rome, armies that numbered in the millions. Now you, Alessandro, after years in their shadow, present this manuscript." He gestured a jeweled hand towards a stack of parchment on the table, bound in worn leather. "You claim these are not just memories, but a map to a different reality, a testament to the true scope of the Tartars' dominion gleaned from your own service to this Kublai." Alessandro met the Doge's gaze, his own dark eyes steady. "Your Serenity, what my father and uncle recounted was but the surface. They were merchants, their eyes fixed on trade and safe passage. I was different. The Khan, in his wisdom or whim, saw fit to use my youth, my quickness with languages, my, forgive me, un-Venetian lack of immediate mercantile ambition, for other purposes." He carried a scar, not physical, but one etched on his perception. The memory of his mother Bianca, who had faded during his father's long first absence, her stories of Constantinople's golden domes and the whispering winds of the Caucasus replaced by the dull clink of counting-house coins. He had grown up on the silence of his father's absence, a silence filled with half-believed rumours carried by returning sailors. When Niccolo and Matteo finally returned, Alessandro was a youth of 15, tall for his age, his mind already a repository of imagined geographies. The Khan's request for a young man of promise to return with them had fallen upon him like a mantle of destiny. "I served the great Khan not as a merchant doge, but as an observer, an emissary to the furthest reaches of his empire," Alessandro continued. "He sent me to lands even his own Tartar governors found remote, to Yunkai, the Cloud Province, where rivers the colour of jade carve through forests thick with unknown spices and beasts that defy description, to the high plateaus where the air is thin and the stars seem close enough to touch, and where men live in harmony with creatures of horn and shaggy fur. I saw them use black stones that burned like wood, paper that passed as gold, and a system of couriers that could carry a message from the edge of the sunrise to the Khan's summer palace in Xanadu in mere weeks." His voice was not boastful, but carried the quiet conviction of one who has witnessed the undeniable. His goal, initially, had been to fulfill the Khan's request, to prove himself to the father he barely knew. But over 17 years, that goal had morphed. It became a burning desire to understand, to absorb the sheer, overwhelming diversity of the Mongol Imperium, its brutal efficiency, its surprising tolerance, its advanced, almost alien technologies. And then an even deeper longing, to return, not just to Venice, but to bring this understanding with him, to bridge the chasm of ignorance that separated his vibrant, chaotic, mercantile West from the vast, ordered and ancient East. "These are not fables, Your Serenity," Alessandro stated, his hand resting on the manuscript. "They are observations, records. I have detailed their systems of governance, their methods of warfare, their customs, their beliefs. I have sketched their cities, their animals, their plants. It is a world, Doge, far larger, far more complex, and in many ways far more advanced than our own." The Doge remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the young man. Venice thrived on trade, on knowledge of distant markets. But this spoke of empires that dwarfed their own ambitions, of powers that could reshape the very fabric of their world. The potential was immense. So was the danger of disbelief, or worse, of knowledge falling into the wrong hands. Genoa, perhaps. "And this, Rusticello of Pisa?" the Doge finally asked, his voice betraying a hint of skepticism. A writer of romances, you say, transcribed these truths while you languished in a Genoese prison after the unfortunate business off Kurzola. Alessandro nodded. It was a strange fate, your serenity, captured at sea, thrown into the darkness, only to find a man whose trade was words. I spoke, he wrote. He questioned, he clarified. He sometimes perhaps added a flourish for his own audience, but the core, the substance, that is mine. That is what I saw. He remembered the endless damp days, the scratching of Rusticello's quill, the slow unfurling of 17 years of memory into narrative. It was in that Genesse cell that his experiences, once personal, began their journey to becoming a legacy. The relationship with his father, Niccolò, and uncle Matteo had been one of initial guidance, then shared experience, and finally a divergence. They had returned to Venice as wealthy men, their tales eventually becoming familiar, if still wondrous. Alessandro, however, had stayed longer, delved deeper, and returned with a different kind of treasure. Knowledge that was harder to quantify, harder to believe, and potentially far more transformative. The great Khan, Kublai, had been a figure of immense power and equally immense curiosity. He had seen in the young, observant Venetian not just a servant, but a window to a different world. Alessandro had navigated the Khan's court with a mixture of Venetian adaptability and an almost scholarly detachment, his foreignness an asset, granting him a unique perspective, free from local factions. But even the Khan's favour could not hold him indefinitely. The longing for the tang of salt air, for the chime of Venetian bells, for a world that, despite its limitations, was his, had grown too strong. The journey home, escorting a Mongol princess to Persia by sea, had been brutal. Storms, disease, death. More than half the fleet had perished, yet he had survived, driven by the need to deliver his mental cargo. Your manuscript will be studied, Alessandro Chirini, the Doge said at last, his voice decisive. By trusted scholars, in secret. Venice must understand the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. But be warned, some truths are too large for small minds, and some knowledge is a dangerous burden. Alessandro bowed his head. He understood. He had lived that burden. He had seen the disbelief in his own family's eyes upon his return, their clothes foreign, their speech accented with Tartar and Persian inflections. He knew the whispers that would follow, Quirini's fables, or perhaps the million lies, after his uncle's oft-repeated exclamations of, "A million this, a million that." But he also knew what he had seen. And he knew, with a certainty that transcended the Doge's caution, that the words now bound in leather held the power to stretch the horizons of his world. Whether they would be embraced as a map or dismissed as a madman's dream remained to be seen. His journey had ended, but the journey of his story was just beginning. The Doge, true to his word, appointed a small discreet council of Venice's sharpest minds, seasoned diplomats, pragmatic merchants from the Council of Ten, and Fra Mauro, the city's most renowned cartographer, whose workshop on the island of Murano was a nexus of geographical speculation. Alessandro was summoned repeatedly, subjected to days of relentless questioning. They probed every detail, the precise distances between cities, the nature of Mongol armaments, the intricacies of their paper currency, a concept that particularly baffled the silver-valuing Venetians, the hierarchies of the Khan's court. Fra Mauro, a stooped man with eyes that seemed to have already mapped the heavens, was perhaps the most challenging. He would unroll vast, beautiful parchments, his own painstakingly drawn Mappa Mundi, a tapestry of known lands, biblical interpretations, and sailors' half-truths. "Show me, Signor Chirini," he would demand, his finger tracing a tentative line eastward, "where this Xanadu lies. How does this river of stars you speak of reconcile with the known headwaters of the Indus?" Alessandro, patient and precise, would take the offered stylus. He would sketch on spare parchment the vast, rectangular grid of Khanbalik, modern Beijing, describe the Grand Canal stretching for hundreds of miles, the sheer scale of which made Venice's waterways seem like garden ponds. He would sketch on spare parchment the vast, rectangular grid of Khanbalik, modern Beijing, describe the Grand Canal stretching for hundreds of miles, the sheer scale of which made Venice's waterways immortal. He spoke of the Pamirs, the roof of the world, where the snows never melted and the air was so thin it made men gasp. He detailed the Gobi, a sea of sand where visions danced in the heat haze and entire caravans could vanish without a trace. He spoke of strange beasts, the unicorn, a rhinoceros, striped horses, zebras encountered further south, perhaps through trade accounts he'd heard, and immense serpents, crocodiles or large pythons. The accounts are consistent, Fra Mauro grudgingly admitted to the Doge after one such session, his brow furrowed in thought. The distances, while immense, maintain a certain internal logic. The descriptions of customs, while alien, do not overtly contradict what little we have gleaned from other, less reliable sources. It is either a meticulously constructed fabrication on a scale never before imagined, or it is largely true. And if it is true, serenity, our maps are but children's drawings. The merchants on the council were particularly intrigued by Alessandro's descriptions of the Yam system, the Mongol network of post stations with thousands of horses ready to carry imperial messages at astonishing speed. Such a system, one muttered, stroking his beard, applied to commerce. The implications are staggering. They pressed him for details on trade routes, on the sources of spices, silks, and precious stones, their minds already calculating potential profits and risks. Alessandro answered them all, but his focus and the core of his manuscript lay beyond mere commerce. He spoke of the Mongol tolerance for different faiths, Nestorians, Muslims, Buddhists, all practicing openly within the Khan's domain, a stark contrast to the religious strife that often plagued Europe. He described the Khan's fascination with foreign physicians, astronomers, and engineers, his willingness to learn from conquered peoples. My father, Niccolò, and uncle, Matteo, Alessandro recounted in his manuscript, the words transcribed by Rustichello echoing in his memory, were tasked by the great Khan on their first return to seek out 100 wise men of the Christian faith, to bring back oil from the lamp of the Holy Sepulchre. He was not seeking conversion, I believe, but understanding. He collected wisdom as other rulers collect gold. This aspect, the intellectual curiosity of the barbarian Khan, was perhaps the most difficult for the Venetians to grasp. Life in Venice was a disorienting blend of the familiar and the alienating for Alessandro. The scent of the lagoon, the cries of the gondoliers, the taste of fresh seafood, these were visceral comforts. But the city felt small, its concerns petty, after the vastness of the Mongol Empire. His former peers, now established merchants or city officials, regarded him with a mixture of awe, envy, and deep suspicion. His tales, when he chose to share them, were often met with polite smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes, or with outright accusations of exaggeration. 1,000,000 Tartars, Alessandro? Truly? They would scoff, echoing his uncle Matteo's exuberant but often imprecise storytelling style, which had unfortunately coloured the reception of all polo narratives. He found solace in Fra Mauro's workshop. The cartographer, though initially sceptical, became Alessandro's most dedicated interrogator and eventually his most profound believer. Together they would spend hours, Alessandro dictating, sketching, clarifying, while Fra Mauro, his old hands surprisingly steady, translated these verbal accounts into new lines on parchment. Slowly, painstakingly, the eastern quarter of Fra Mauro's great Mappamundi began to transform. Coastlines shifted, mountains rose where none had been depicted, cities bloomed in the blank spaces. It was a cartographic revolution, born from one man's memory and another's meticulous skill. He does not merely describe places, Father Abbot, Fra Mauro later wrote to a colleague in Rome. He describes a system, an empire that functions on a scale we can barely comprehend. If even half of what Signor Chirini recounts is accurate, then Christendom is but a small collection of squabbling fiefdoms on the western fringe of a world dominated by this great Khan. The implications for our faith, for our future, are sobering. Alessandro, however, was not driven by grand geopolitical strategies or religious angst. His motivation was simpler, more fundamental. To bear witness. He had seen a different way of being, a different scale of human endeavour, and he felt an overwhelming compulsion to make it known, to share the wonder and the complexity. He had fulfilled his duty to the Khan, his duty to his family by returning. Now, his duty was to his story. He remembered the words attributed to him on his supposed deathbed in the original tales, though he was far from that point now. I did not tell half of what I saw. The truth was, even with Rustichello's diligent pen, even with Fra Mauro's expanding maps, he felt he could never truly convey the overwhelming sensory reality of those 17 years. How to describe the sound of 1,000 Mongol war drums beating in unison, the scent of yak butter tea in a felt yurt, the sight of the Khan's summer palace in Xanadu, its roofs seemingly made of gold, shimmering in the clear high-altitude light. The manuscript, which Rustichello had titled The Description of the World, but which was already being informally dubbed Il Milione, the million, in Venice due to the recurring theme of vast numbers, was slowly, carefully, being copied by scribes under the Doge's orders. Its dissemination would be controlled, its contents studied for strategic advantage. Alessandro understood the necessity of this. Venice was a city built on secrets as much as on water. Yet, he also knew that stories, like water, have a way of seeping through barriers. He had brought back more than just memories. He had brought back a few carefully chosen artifacts, a bolt of silk woven with patterns he'd never seen in the Levant, a small, intricately carved jade amulet given to him by a Yunkai governor, a set of Mongol travel dice. These were tangible proofs, anchors for his incredible tales. He would sometimes show them to trusted friends, to Fra Mauro, their presence lending a quiet weight to his words. The world was changing, whether Venice was ready for it or not. Alessandro Querini, the boy who had chased his father's shadow to the ends of the earth, had returned as a harbinger of that change, his voice, and his book, a bridge between two vastly different yet inextricably linked worlds. Alessandro Querini, the boy who had chased his father's shadow to the ends of the earth, had returned as a harbinger of that change, his voice and his book, a bridge between two vastly different yet inextricably ghouls. The Querini Manuscript, as the Doge's council formally termed it, began its slow, clandestine journey through the corridors of Venetian power. Its impact was not immediate or explosive, but rather a gradual seeping, a re-evaluation of long-held assumptions. Merchants on the Rialto, who had once dismissed talk of lands beyond Trebizond as sailors' fancy, began to listen more intently to Alessandro's carefully managed public utterances, filtering them for commercial clues. Shipwrights at the Arsenale, while not privy to the full text, heard whispers of immense eastern fleets and began to subtly alter designs, considering vessels capable of longer, more arduous voyages. Alessandro, though still an object of curiosity and some lingering doubt, found his status subtly shifting. He was no longer just Niccolo's boy who went to Cathay. He was Alessandro Querini, the man who had served the great Khan, the one whose knowledge was deemed vital enough for the Doge's personal attention. He was given modest chambers near the Palazzo Ducale, less for comfort and more for ease of access by the scholars and strategists who continued to dissect his accounts. One such strategist was a man named Marco Giustiniani, a stern, pragmatic member of the Quarantia, Venice's highest civil and criminal court, also deeply involved in the Republic's intelligence gathering. Giustiniani was less interested in burning stones or paper money than in Alessandro's descriptions of Mongol military organization, their supply chains, their methods of siege warfare, and most crucially, their internal political dynamics. This Khan Kublai, Giustiniani would press, his eyes like chips of flint. You say he is old, that his empire frays at the edges. Who are his likely successors? What are their strengths, their weaknesses? Are there factions within his court that Venice might cultivate? Alessandro understood the implications. Venice, ever the opportunist, was already seeking fissures, potential leverage points in this colossal eastern power. He answered Giustiniani's questions truthfully, recounting the simmering rivalries among the Khan's sons and grandsons, the distinct cultural differences between the Mongol heartland and the newly conquered territories of the Song dynasty in the south. He described the vast bureaucracy, efficient yet prone to corruption in its distant provinces. The Khan's authority is absolute, Alessandro explained, drawing from a section of his manuscript, but an empire built on conquest must continue to conquer, or risk stagnation and internal strife. Kublai is a builder as much as a warrior, but those who follow may only remember the sword. These sessions were draining. Alessandro felt like a well from which Venice was determined to draw every last drop of strategic water. He longed for the straightforward complexities of the Khan's court, where his role, though foreign, had been clearly defined. Here he was a resource, an anomaly, a potential threat, and a prized possession all at once. His relationship with his father and uncle remained complex. Niccolo and Matteo, now aging, were content with their accumulated wealth and the local prestige their own earlier adventures had brought them. They were proud of Alessandro, yet also somewhat bewildered by the depth and nature of his experiences. Their East had been one of trade, of tangible goods. Alessandro's East was one of systems, of ideas, of a civilization whose inner workings he had glimpsed in a way they never had. "You speak of things, Alessandro," Niccolo once said, shaking his head after Alessandro tried to explain the philosophical underpinnings of the Khan's religious tolerance, "that are best left to theologians and dreamers. Silk, spices, gems, these are the true currency between nations." Alessandro knew his father meant well, but a gulf had opened between them, a distance measured not in miles but in understanding. It was Fra Mauro who provided the most profound intellectual companionship. The cartographer's initial skepticism had transformed into an almost obsessive quest for accuracy. His workshop became Alessandro's sanctuary. There, amidst the scent of ink, parchment, and drying pigments, they were not Venetian and Tartar-influenced anomaly, but two scholars engaged in a monumental task, redrawing the world. The coastline of Cathay, Fra Mauro would muse, his stylus hovering over a new projection. If your descriptions of the voyages you undertook for the Khan to the southern islands, Cipangu and the Indies, are accurate, then the ocean sea is not as empty as Ptolemy suggested. There may be other lands, reachable by sea even further east. Alessandro would recount his voyages along the coasts of Champa, Java, and what he understood to be the fringes of India. He described the seasonal monsoons, the different constellations visible in the southern skies, the tales he'd heard from Arab and Chinese sailors of islands rich in spices and even stranger wonders. These were not lands he had explored deeply, but his observations as a passenger on Mongol fleets, his conversations with seasoned mariners, provided Fra Mauro with invaluable new data points. "The world is round, Alessandro," Fra Mauro declared one afternoon, a sudden, fierce conviction in his voice, tapping a newly inked globe that incorporated many of Alessandro's eastward revisions. Polo's manuscript confirms it in 1,000 details of travel and time. And if it is round, and if the east extends as far as your account suggests, then perhaps by sailing west one might eventually reach it. The idea, though ancient, gained a new, practical urgency in the context of Alessandro's detailed geography. This was no longer abstract philosophical speculation. It was a navigational possibility, however remote and perilous. The seeds of future voyages westward across the Atlantic were being quietly sown in a Murano workshop, watered by the memories of a Venetian who had travelled east. Alessandro also found an unexpected ally in Domenico Tiepolo, a young, ambitious nobleman who, unlike many of his peers, possessed a genuine intellectual curiosity that extended beyond Venice's immediate commercial interests. Tiepolo, having gained access to a copied section of the manuscript, sought Alessandro out not for strategic advantage, but for sheer understanding. "Tell me of Kanbalik," Tiepolo would ask, his eyes bright. "Is it true the Khan's palace is so vast it contains gardens where herds of deer roam, and that the city's streets are laid out in a perfect grid, unlike our beautiful, chaotic Venice?" With Tiepolo, Alessandro could speak more freely of the wonders, the cultural richness, the sheer human drama of the Mongol court, without the constant undercurrent of political or commercial calculation. He described the elaborate New Year feasts, the trained cheetahs used for hunting, the skill of the Mongol archers, the haunting melodies of their horsehead fiddles. These conversations were a balm to Alessandro. They reminded him that his journey had been more than just an accumulation of strategic data. It had been a profound human experience. And perhaps, he thought, it was this human element, the sense of wonder, of connection to a vastly different yet equally valid way of life, that would be his story's most enduring legacy, more so than any trade route opened or military strategy gleaned. The Doge might control the manuscript, but the story itself, once told, had a life of its own. It was already beginning to inspire not just fear or greed, but also that most Venetian of traits, a boundless curiosity about what lay beyond the horizon. The controlled dissemination of Alessandro's manuscript, the description of the world, continued within Venice's secretive circles. But as Alessandro had anticipated, fragments of his story began to leak beyond the Doge's council. Sailors who had been part of the escort for the Mongol princess spoke in dockside taverns of the terrifying storms in the Indian Ocean, of islands where men worshipped demons, and of the incredible wealth of the lands they had skirted. Merchants, having heard third-hand accounts from council members, started factoring in new distant sources for pepper and cloves, subtly shifting trade calculations. The name Cathay and Cipangu, Japan, began to appear in Venetian ledgers, no longer as mythical lands but as tangible, if remote, destinations. One significant consequence was the quiet, almost reluctant admission among Venice's intellectual elite that their understanding of the world was woefully incomplete. The Church, initially wary of tales that seemed to diminish the centrality of Christendom, found itself grappling with Alessandro's accounts of established Nestorian Christian communities flourishing deep within Asia, tolerated and sometimes even favoured by the Mongol Khans. This challenged the narrative of a purely pagan or Saracen East. Fra Luca Pacioli, a renowned mathematician and theologian visiting Venice, after being granted a supervised viewing of sections pertaining to Mongol administration and their use of flying money paper currency, was reportedly both astonished and deeply troubled. If such a system of abstract value can function across an empire so vast, he was rumoured to have commented, then our own reliance on hard bullion may be more a matter of custom than of inherent necessity. The implications for finance, for the very nature of wealth, are profound. Alessandro, though still under a degree of official observation, was occasionally permitted to attend salons hosted by figures like Domenico Tiepolo. Here, among younger, more open-minded patricians, poets and scholars, he could speak with greater freedom. It was in these gatherings that the human story of his travels began to truly resonate. He described the elaborate Mongol wedding ceremonies, the fierce loyalty of the Khan's personal guard, the surprising sophistication of their urban planning, with broad avenues and sanitation systems that put Venice's reeking canals to shame in some respects. He recounted the story of falling gravely ill in the remote province of Badakhshan, nursed back to health not by Venetian physicians, but by local healers using strange herbs and mountain remedies. He spoke of the sheer, desolate beauty of the Pamir Plateau, where for weeks the only signs of life were the wild sheep with enormous curling horns and the distant figures of nomadic horsemen. They are not unthinking barbarians, as many in Europe imagine, Alessandro would insist, his voice earnest. They are a people of immense vitality, of complex laws, of deep traditions. Their empire is held together not just by force, but by a pragmatic understanding of human nature, by a surprisingly adaptable system of governance, and by the sheer, charismatic power of figures like Kublai Khan. It was these human details, these glimpses into a functioning, sophisticated, different civilization, that began to capture the imagination more than just lists of cities or trade goods. Poets began to weave images of Xanadu into their verses. Playwrights, hearing second-hand of the Khan's theatrical spectacles, started to envision grander, more exotic staging for their own productions. The manuscript itself became an object of immense desire. Scribes, sworn to secrecy, produced a limited number of copies for the Doge's inner circle, but inevitably pages went missing, sections were surreptitiously copied, and garbled versions began to circulate in the academic underworld of Padua and Bologna, carried by Venetian students. These incomplete versions, often missing Alessandro's careful contextualization or Rusticello's narrative structure, sometimes did more harm than good, fueling wild speculation and fantastic embellishments. Tales of men with dogs' heads or of islands made entirely of gold, things Alessandro had explicitly identified as hearsay or local fables in his original account, were presented as observed fact. This frustrated Alessandro immensely. They seize upon the fantastic, he lamented to Fra Mauro, and ignore the truly wondrous, the organization, the engineering, the sheer scale of human achievement. Fra Mauro, ever the pragmatist, merely shrugged. Men prefer marvels to truths, Alessandro. It has always been so. But your core account, the one we are meticulously verifying, that is what will endure. The fables will fade. One day, a Genoese merchant, recently released from a Venetian prison after a trade dispute, approached Alessandro. He had heard rumours of the Querini Manuscript, and more specifically of Alessandro's detailed knowledge of the overland routes to Cathay. "Signor Querini," the Genoese said, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Genoa, too, has interests in the East. Your knowledge could be valuable, perhaps more appreciated, and certainly better rewarded than it is here in your cautious Venice." Alessandro recognized the overture for what it was, an attempt at espionage, an effort to pry Venice's newly acquired secrets from him. He thought of his time in that Genoese prison, of Rustichello's patient quill. He also thought of Venice, his city, for all its flaws and scepticism. "My knowledge, signor," Alessandro replied coolly, "belongs to Venice. It was gained under her flag, however indirectly. I am not for sale." The Genoese merchant departed, his expression unreadable, but Alessandro knew the rivalry between the two maritime republics meant that his story, and the strategic information it contained, would continue to be a coveted prize. The most unexpected impact, perhaps, was on the very fabric of Venetian ambition. For centuries, Venice had seen itself as the preeminent gateway to the East, its merchants the masters of the Levant trade. Alessandro's account revealed an East far vaster, far more complex and far more powerful than they had ever conceived. It was humbling. It suggested that Venice, for all its wealth and naval prowess, was but a small player on a much larger global stage. This realization did not diminish Venetian ambition, but it began to subtly redirect it. If the overland routes were so dominated by the Mongol Khans, then perhaps, as Framaro had speculated, other avenues, westward across the ocean sea, needed to be considered more seriously. The quest for direct sea routes to the Spice Islands of the Indies, bypassing Mongol and Mamluk intermediaries, gained a new urgency. Alessandro Querini, now in his late 30s, watched these ripples spread with a sense of weary satisfaction. He had not become fabulously wealthy from his travels, nor had he sought political power. He lived modestly, his primary occupation now being a consultant to Fra Mauro and an occasional, carefully vetted advisor to the Doge's council. His true wealth was his memory, his true power the story he had brought back. He had not discovered Cathay, but he had described it, and in doing so he had given Europe a new, more complex, and ultimately more accurate vision of the world beyond its borders. He had, in essence, redrawn the mental map of his age, and that, he was beginning to understand, was a legacy more profound than any cargo of silk or spices. The world, once opened, could never truly be closed again. Years continued to pass. Fra Mauro, with Alessandro as his constant guide and source, completed his magnificent Mappa Mundi. It was a marvel of cartography, incorporating vast swathes of Asia with a level of detail and accuracy previously unimaginable. Cathay, the cities of Khanbalik and Zaitun, the Himalayas, the Indus River, the Indian Peninsula, all were depicted with a new confidence, directly influenced by Alessandro's manuscript and personal testimony. The map became a prized possession of the Venetian Republic, a symbol of its global reach and understanding, though its full implications were still being digested. It was, in many ways, Alessandro's most visible legacy, a tangible representation of the world he had unveiled. Alessandro, now entering middle age, found a new role for himself. The Doge, recognizing the unique value of his experiences, began to use him in more subtle diplomatic capacities. When envoys arrived from Eastern potentates, Armenian princes, Persian emissaries, even occasional traders from the fringes of the Black Sea Khanates, Alessandro was often called upon. His fluency in several dialects of Turkic and Persian, his understanding of Eastern court etiquette, his ability to speak with first-hand knowledge of the great Khan's power made him an invaluable intermediary. He could decipher nuances in diplomatic language that other Venetians missed, sense underlying intentions, and advise the Doge on appropriate responses. He was, in effect, Venice's unofficial minister of Eastern affairs, a position that existed nowhere in the Republic's formal structures but was acknowledged in practice. He never married, nor did he show much interest in accumulating wealth. His life remained dedicated to the knowledge he carried. He established a small scriptorium, employing a few trusted scribes to produce accurate, unembellished copies of the description of the world. He did this not for profit, but to counteract the garbled, sensationalized versions that still circulated. He wanted his account, Rustichello's narrative structure preserved, to be available to genuine scholars, to those who sought understanding rather than mere marvels. These Quirini codices, as they came to be known, were painstakingly produced and selectively distributed to monastic libraries, university scholars, and even a few enlightened patrons of learning beyond Venice, often through Domenico Tiepolo's network. One such codex found its way to the court of Portugal, into the hands of a young prince named Henry, who was already dreaming of voyages down the coast of Africa and beyond. Another reached the scholars of Florence, where it was rumoured to have been studied by Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli, the physician and cosmographer whose own maps would later influence a certain Genoese mariner with ambitions to sail west. The seeds Alessandro had planted continued to spread, carried by the currents of intellectual curiosity. The skepticism surrounding his accounts never entirely vanished, of course. There were always those in Venice and beyond who dismissed his stories as exaggerations, as il milione, a million wonders too fantastic to be true. They pointed to the lack of corroborating accounts from other Western travellers, few though they were, and none with Alessandro's depth of experience. They questioned how a mere Venetian could have gained such intimate access to the court of the most powerful ruler on earth. Alessandro rarely bothered to engage with these detractors directly. His manuscript and Fra Mauro's map spoke for themselves. He knew what he had seen, what he had lived. He understood that the human mind often struggled to encompass realities so far beyond its own experience. His response was simply to continue his scholarly work, to ensure the integrity of his account. He did, however, take a quiet satisfaction in small vindications. When a Venetian trading galley venturing further east into the Black Sea than ever before returned with tales of encountering Mongol officials who confirmed certain administrative details Alessandro had described, or when a visiting Franciscan friar who had journeyed overland to Persia corroborated his descriptions of Zoroastrian customs, these small affirmations lent further weight to his larger narrative. His father, Niccolo, and uncle, Matteo, passed away, rich and respected, their own pioneering journeys now part of Venetian lore, though somewhat overshadowed by the sheer scale and detail of Alessandro's later account. Alessandro mourned them, the complex figures who had, by their own ambition and Kublai Khan's peculiar request, set him on his life's extraordinary path. He inherited a portion of their wealth, which he used primarily to fund his scriptorium and to support Fra Mauro's ongoing cartographic research until the great mapmaker, too, passed from the world. As he grew older, Alessandro became a living repository of knowledge about the East. Young merchants contemplating ventures into Persia or beyond would seek his counsel. Aspiring diplomats would study his manuscript as a primer on Eastern statecraft. He was a link, a bridge, not just between Venice and Cathay, but between generations. He had seen a world that was already changing. Kublai Khan had died years ago, and the vast Mongol Empire, as he had predicted, was indeed beginning to show signs of fragmentation. His account was becoming not just a description of a contemporary reality, but a historical record of a unique period, the zenith of Mongol power. One evening, Domenico Tiepolo, himself now a respected elder statesman of the Republic, visited Alessandro. They sat in Alessandro's quiet study, surrounded by books, maps, and the faint, lingering scent of exotic inks and aged parchment. "Your million, Alessandro," Tiepolo said, a fond smile playing on his lips. "It has done more to shape Venice's understanding of the world, and indeed Europe's, than any fleet of galleys or pronouncement from the Doge's throne." Alessandro looked out at the fading light over the Venetian rooftops. "I merely described what I saw, Domenico. The world itself did the shaping." "Perhaps," Tiepolo conceded, "but it required an eye to see it, a mind to comprehend it, and a voice, or a pen, to give it form. You were that voice, Alessandro. Even when many wished only for fables, you gave them truth, however uncomfortable or vast." Alessandro Quirini lived to a venerable age, passing away quietly in his beloved Venice, the city of his birth and his final return. He left no grand monuments, no vast fortune. His will was simple. His remaining artifacts from the East, the silks, the jade, the Mongol dice, were to be preserved in the Doge's collection. His scriptorium and the master copies of his manuscript were entrusted to Domenico Tiepolo's family, with the instruction that they continue to make accurate copies available to those who sought genuine knowledge. He also freed, with a generous provision, an old Tartar servant named Bayan, who had accompanied him from the Khan's lands and served him faithfully for decades in Venice, a final personal nod to the world that had so profoundly shaped his soul. Even on his deathbed, the story goes, a skeptical friar urged him to recant the more unbelievable portions of his tale. Alessandro, his voice weak but his eyes still holding a distant clarity, is said to have whispered, "I did not tell half of what I saw." Whether apocryphal or not, the sentiment rang true. His real achievement was not the miles he walked, but the horizons he stretched. And long after his footsteps faded from the Silk Road, long after the ink dried on Rusticello's parchment and Framauro's map, the echo of his voice, captured in the description of the world, continued to resonate, urging Europe to look eastward, and indeed outward, to a world far greater and far more wondrous than it had ever dared to imagine. His journey had bridged two worlds, and in doing so had irrevocably changed both. The death of Alessandro Querini did not diminish the power of his narrative. If anything, it solidified its status. With the man himself gone, unable to be questioned or doubted in person, the description of the world began to take on a life of its own, evolving from a contemporary account into a foundational text. The Querini codices, meticulously preserved and selectively copied, became treasures of monastic libraries and the private collections of Europe's burgeoning intellectual class. While Venice still officially controlled the master narrative for strategic purposes, the story, in its myriad forms, was too compelling to be contained. In Florence, a city experiencing its own renaissance, Alessandro's descriptions of Khan Balik's grandeur and the sophisticated administration of the Mongol Empire sparked discussions among humanist scholars. Could it be that civilization was not solely a Greco-Roman or Christian inheritance? Figures like Paolo Toscanelli, poring over translated excerpts, used Alessandro's geographical data to refine their own cosmological theories, arguing for the feasibility of a westward passage to the Indies, a direct intellectual lineage from Querini's Eastern journey. The detailed accounts of advanced Eastern technologies, from coal as fuel to complex canal systems, subtly challenged European assumptions of their own technological superiority, prompting a quiet but persistent curiosity about lost or foreign knowledge. Further afield in the Iberian Peninsula, navigators and royal patrons, hungry for a way to circumvent the Venetian and Genoese monopolies on the overland spice trade, found in Alessandro's tales not just wonder, but a strategic imperative. His descriptions of the immense wealth of Cathay and the Spice Islands of the Indies, even if filtered through layers of transcription and translation, painted a tantalizing picture. If the East was as vast and rich as Querini claimed, then finding a direct sea route was no longer a mere commercial ambition, but a geopolitical necessity. A Genoese mariner, a certain Cristoforo Colombo, was known to have obsessively studied a Latin translation of a similar travelogue, its margins filled with his own excited annotations, directly inspired by the Venetian's pioneering journey. Alessandro's 17 years in the service of the Khan, his meticulous observations recorded in a Genoese prison, were now, decades after his death, fueling the dreams of men who would sail into uncharted western oceans. The irony was not lost on the more astute Venetian observers. While Venice had sought to control Alessandro's knowledge for its own immediate benefit, the true power of his story lay in its ability to inspire a broader pan-European ambition that would eventually challenge Venice's own dominance. The world Alessandro had opened up was too large for any single city-state, even one as powerful as La Serenissima, to monopolize. Within Venice itself, Alessandro Querini became a figure of legend. The man who had been met with skepticism was now celebrated as a native son who had dared to venture where no Venetian had gone so deeply before. His modest house near the Palazzo Ducale became an unofficial landmark. Young boys playing along the canals would tell each other embellished tales of Alessandro the great traveller, and his encounters with diamond-studded unicorns and armies that drank rivers dry, the very fables he had sought to dispel, now ironically part of his popular myth. Yet, among scholars, the core accuracy of his account continued to gain credence. As more fragmentary reports trickled in from missionaries and merchants venturing into Persia and Central Asia, they often, surprisingly, corroborated details from Alessandro's manuscript. a specific custom, a geographical feature, a political reality. The sheer internal consistency of his narrative, the logical progression of his journeys, the detailed and practical nature of many of his observations stood up to scrutiny in a way that purely fantastical tales did not. The artifacts he had brought back, the bolt of intricate silk, the jade amulet, the Mongol dice, were now displayed with reverence in the Doge's treasury, tangible links to a world he had made real for Venice. From Mauro's Mappamundi, with Quirini's East, so prominently and accurately depicted, became the standard against which all other maps were judged. It was, in essence, a visual summary of Alessandro's gift to his city and to the world. The enduring legacy of Alessandro Quirini was not simply that he had travelled and returned. It was that he had observed, recorded and persisted in sharing his truth, even in the face of disbelief. He had demonstrated that one individual, armed with curiosity, resilience and a dedication to accurate witness, could fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of its own planet. His manuscript was more than a travelogue. It was an act of intellectual courage. It taught Europe that the world was not a closed, finite space defined by ancient authorities, but an open, dynamic, and astonishingly diverse tapestry, still waiting to be fully explored and understood. Generations later, when Venetian galleys finally did round the Cape of Good Hope, and when European ships made landfall in the Americas, the intellectual groundwork for comprehending such vast new worlds had, in part, been laid by the Venetian, who had journeyed to the court of Kublai Khan. Alessandro Quirini had not set out to change the world. He had merely sought to understand it, and to share that understanding. But in doing so, he had bequeathed to posterity a gift of immeasurable value, the unshakable knowledge that wonder and wisdom often lay just beyond the familiar horizon, waiting for those with the courage to seek it out and the diligence to record what they found. His was the transformative power of a cross-cultural encounter, amplified by the enduring legacy of the recorded word, echoing down the centuries. The intellectual currents stirred by Alessandro Quirini's manuscript continued to flow, often in unseen ways, through the intellectual bedrock of Europe. In Padua, a university city under Venetian influence, medical scholars began to subtly question the absolute authority of Galen after reading Alessandro's translated descriptions of Chinese medical practices, particularly their diagnostic skills and herbal pharmacopoeia, which, while alien, hinted at different, potentially effective systems of healing. Though direct adoption was slow and met with resistance, the mere awareness that other sophisticated medical traditions existed began to erode the edifice of unquestioned dogma. Similarly, Alessandro's accounts of Mongol siege engineering and their use of gunpowder in warfare, though initially viewed with a mixture of awe and alarm by Venetian military strategists, eventually spurred innovation within Europe. While gunpowder was not unknown, the scale and sophistication of its application by the Mongols, as detailed by Quirini, prompted European powers to accelerate their own experimentation and development of firearms and artillery. The black stones that burned were no longer just a curiosity, but a strategic imperative. Alessandro's observations, intended as neutral reportage, inadvertently contributed to a shift in the balance of military power in the centuries that followed. The enduring power of the description of the world also lay in its almost accidental role as a work of literature. Rustichello da Pisa, the romance writer who had transcribed Alessandro's oral account in that Genoese prison, had undeniably infused the narrative with a certain flair, a storyteller's instinct for pacing and drama. While Alessandro had insisted on factual accuracy, Rustichello's hand had helped shape the raw data of 17 years of experience into a compelling, readable narrative. This literary quality, even in translation, contributed significantly to its widespread appeal beyond purely scholarly or strategic circles. It became a book that could be read not just for information, but for the sheer adventure and wonder of it all. This popular appeal, however, continued to be a double-edged sword. The very elements that made it captivating, the immense distances, the staggering wealth, the exotic customs, also fueled the persistent skepticism and the tendency towards embellishment. The Quirini, who entered popular European folklore, was often a more fantastical figure than the meticulous observer Alessandro himself had been. He became the hero of chapbooks and ballads, battling mythical beasts in the Orient, and dining with emperors whose palaces were paved with emeralds. This popular image, while ensuring his name remained known, often obscured the true intellectual and cultural significance of his work. Yet, beneath the layer of popular myth, the genuine impact persisted. The meticulous detail in Alessandro's descriptions of trade goods, the types of silks, the origins of spices like ginger and cinnamon, the varieties of porcelain, the quality of pearls from Cipangu, provided invaluable practical information for generations of European merchants. Even if they couldn't immediately reach Cathay, this knowledge informed their negotiations with Arab and Levantine middlemen, giving them a better understanding of the value and origin of the goods they sought. It empowered them to ask more pointed questions, to demand better quality, to seek out new, if still indirect, supply lines. Moreover, Alessandro's candid descriptions of the diverse peoples and religions within the Mongol Empire subtly chipped away at Europe's often monolithic and hostile view of the other. His accounts of Nestorians, Muslims, Buddhists, and various animist traditions coexisting, sometimes uneasily but often peacefully, under Mongol rule, presented a picture of religious plurality that was almost inconceivable in religiously fractured Europe. While it didn't lead to immediate tolerance, it planted a seed of awareness that the world beyond Christendom was not a homogeneous block of infidels, but a complex tapestry of beliefs and cultures. The city of Venice, having initially guarded the Querini manuscript so closely, eventually came to see it as one of its cultural treasures, a testament to the daring and global reach of its citizens. The Querini codices, produced in Alessandro's scriptorium, became models of fine penmanship and illumination, sought after by wealthy collectors. The Doge's treasury, displaying Alessandro's Eastern artifacts, became a point of pilgrimage for visiting dignitaries and scholars, tangible proof of the worlds he had described. As the centuries unfolded, and as direct European contact with China and other parts of Asia became more common, Alessandro Querini's account was revisited and re-evaluated. Historians and geographers, armed with new information, would compare later accounts with his. Remarkably, despite the inevitable limitations of a single observer and the challenges of translation and transcription, the core of Alessandro's observations, his descriptions of locations, customs, political structures, and trade, proved to be astonishingly accurate in many respects. Remarkably, despite the inevitable limitations of a single observer and the challenges of translation and transcription, the core of Alessandro's observations, his descriptions of locations, customs of thugs. The million lies increasingly looked like a million truths, or at least a million carefully observed realities. His true legacy, therefore, was not merely the popular myth or the strategic intelligence, but the profound shift in perspective he engendered. He demonstrated that dedicated empirical observation could yield knowledge capable of transforming worldviews. He embodied the spirit of the explorer who seeks not to conquer, but to understand and to share. In an age when much of the world remained shrouded in mystery and myth, Alessandro Querini, through his extraordinary journey and his even more extraordinary record, had lit a lamp, illuminating vast, previously unimagined realms of human experience. In an age when much of the world remained shrouded in mystery and myth, Alessandro Querini, through his extraordinary journey and his even more extraordinary record, had lit a lamp, illuminating vast, previously unimagined realms of human vubd. The light from that lamp, passed down through his manuscript, would guide the curious, the ambitious, and the courageous for generations to come, forever reminding them that the boundaries of the known world were merely waiting to be pushed further. His life was a testament to the transformative power of stepping into the unknown and the enduring impact of bringing its story home. The echoes of Alessandro Querini's journey resonated most profoundly, perhaps, in the subtle ways it reshaped the very language of possibility in Venice and beyond. Before him, Cathay was a whisper, a near-mythical land at the edge of imagination. After him, it became a place with coordinates, however approximate, with described cities, peoples, and systems. This transition from myth to tangible, if distant, reality was a crucial intellectual leap. It fostered a mindset where the unknown was not necessarily unknowable, but rather a frontier awaiting diligent inquiry. Consider the impact on artistic representation. Venetian painters, renowned for their vibrant colours and increasingly realistic depictions of their own world, began to incorporate subtle Oriental motifs into their works, often drawn from descriptions filtered through Alessandro's account or from the artifacts he brought back. A certain richness in a brocade, a peculiar curve to a scimitar in a battle scene, the depiction of a Tartar face with a new, less caricatured specificity. These were small brushstrokes, but they indicated a broadening visual vocabulary, an attempt to incorporate a newly expanded world into their artistic consciousness. The adoration of the Magi, a common theme, might suddenly feature a king whose robes and retinue hinted at the splendours of the distant East that Querini had described. In the realm of statecraft, Alessandro's detailed observations of the highly centralized, hierarchical and meritocratic, at least in theory, aspects of Mongol administration offered a fascinating, if sometimes troubling, counterpoint to Venice's complex republican system of councils and elected officials. While no Venetian statesman would advocate for adopting Mongol autocracy, the sheer efficiency of certain aspects of their governance, particularly the Yam courier system and their methods of census-taking and resource management across vast territories, prompted quiet studies and discussions. Could elements of such efficiency be adapted to serve the Republic's needs, without compromising its cherished liberties? The questions themselves were a product of Querini's new information. Even the concept of wealth began to subtly expand. Alessandro's insistence on the functionality of paper currency, backed by the Khan's authority, while initially baffling to bullion-obsessed Venetian bankers, planted a seed for later considerations of fiat money and more abstract forms of credit. If an empire as vast as Cathay could operate on such a system, it challenged the fundamental European association of wealth solely with precious metals. This was a slow burn, an idea that would take centuries to fully mature, but the initial spark came from these tales of a different economic reality. The very act of Alessandro's collaboration with Rustichello da Pisa in that Genoese prison also highlighted the power of narrative itself. Rustichello, a writer of chivalric romances, brought his skills in structuring stories, in creating compelling characters, even if the character was the great Khan, or Alessandro himself as protagonist, to the raw material of Alessandro's experiences. This fusion of observed fact and narrative craft was crucial to the manuscript's enduring appeal. It demonstrated that for knowledge to be truly impactful, it often needed to be not just accurate, but also well told. This understanding subtly influenced other Venetian chroniclers and historians, who began to pay more attention to the narrative force of their own accounts. The psychological impact on Venice was also significant. For a city that prided itself on its worldly sophistication and its position as the nexus between East and West, Alessandro's revelations were a form of recalibration. The East was not just the Levant or Alexandria, the traditional termini of Venetian trade. It was a civilization, or a collection of civilizations, that dwarfed their immediate sphere of interaction. This could have been demoralizing, but for a spirit as resilient and adaptable as Venice's, it became a new challenge, a new frontier of opportunity. It spurred a desire not just to trade with the fringes, but to understand, and perhaps one day directly engage with, these deeper, more distant centers of power and wealth. One can imagine a young Venetian apprentice, perhaps in a counting house or a scholar's study, years after Alessandro's death, secretly reading a treasured illicit copy of the Description of the World. His world, previously bounded by the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, suddenly explodes outwards. He reads of cities with millions of inhabitants, of emperors commanding armies larger than the entire population of Italy, of deserts that take months to cross, of oceans teeming with unknown islands. His ambition, his understanding of what is possible, is irrevocably altered. He might not become an explorer himself, but he will conduct his business, cast his vote in the council, or raise his children with a subtly expanded worldview. All thanks to the legacy of Alessandro Querini. This, ultimately, was the most profound transformation, the expansion of the collective Venetian and gradually European imagination. Alessandro Querini, through the meticulous recording of his extraordinary journey, had given his contemporaries not just new facts, but a new framework for understanding their place in a much larger, more complex, and infinitely more fascinating world. He had shown that the most valuable voyages were not always those that returned laden with gold, but those that returned laden with understanding, with stories capable of reshaping the very contours of thought. The echoes of his journey were not just in maps or trade routes, but in the minds of those who came after, forever changed by the revelation of what lay beyond. The narrative of Alessandro Querini, as it solidified into legend and historical record, served as a constant, if sometimes subliminal, reminder to Venice of the value of direct observation and first-hand experience. In an age where much knowledge was still derived from ancient texts and scholastic debate, Alessandro's manuscript stood as a powerful testament to the insights gained from actually going and seeing. This empirical spirit, though not unique to Venice, was certainly amplified by his example. It encouraged a certain boldness in Venetian explorers, merchants and diplomats who followed, a willingness to trust their own eyes and judgment, even when it contradicted established wisdom. Consider the Venetian glassmakers of Murano, already famed for their artistry. Hearing of the Khan's vast palaces, of windows perhaps larger or clearer than their own, or of different techniques for colouring and shaping glass in the distant East, even if these were only hinted at in Alessandro's account, could have spurred a competitive innovation, a desire to prove Venetian craftsmanship unparalleled. The awareness of a sophisticated other often acts as a catalyst for refining one's own skills and pushing creative boundaries. Furthermore, Alessandro's descriptions of the diverse flora and fauna of Asia, while sometimes filtered through the lens of medieval understanding, his unicorns being rhinoceroses, for example, nonetheless expanded the known bestiary and pharmacopoeia. Venetian apothecaries and physicians, even if they couldn't immediately access these exotic plants and animal products, became aware of their existence. This could lead to a more discerning eye when examining goods brought by Arab traders, a search for rumoured ingredients, and eventually a desire to control the sources of these valuable commodities. The materia medica of Europe was subtly enriched by these glimpses into distant ecosystems. The legal and administrative minds in Venice, while perhaps not directly adopting Mongol practices, would have found Alessandro's descriptions of their systems of law, taxation, and provincial governance to be a fascinating case study. The sheer scale of the Mongol Empire required administrative solutions that were, by necessity, different from those of a compact city-state. Reading about how the Khans managed such diversity, enforced their decrees over vast distances, and collected revenues from disparate peoples could offer valuable lessons in comparative governance, even if only to highlight the unique strengths and weaknesses of Venice's own system. For instance, the Mongol concept of a unified legal code applied across different ethnicities and religions, while not transferable to the Venetian context, might spark thought about the principles of universal versus local law. Alessandro's story also contributed to the development of a more nuanced European understanding of empire. Before his detailed account, empire often evoked the Roman model or the more immediate threat of Saracen expansion. Querini presented a different model, a nomadic conquest empire that had established a surprisingly stable and, in some areas, highly sophisticated sedentary administration. This complexity challenged simplistic notions of barbarian rule and forced a more considered analysis of how power was constituted and maintained on a global scale. The very existence of Il Milione, a book describing such vast and distant realities, also subtly underscored the importance of literacy and record-keeping. In an age where literacy was still far from universal, a manuscript that held the keys to understanding such a significant portion of the world became an object of immense value, not just for its content, but as a symbol of the power of the written word. It encouraged the copying of texts, the establishment of libraries, and the scholarly pursuit of knowledge. Alessandro's collaboration with Rustichello, a professional writer, also highlighted the emerging role of the author and the scribe in shaping and disseminating knowledge. One can also speculate on the personal impact on those Venetians who, like Domenico Tiepolo, formed genuine intellectual friendships with Alessandro. For them, he was not just a source of information, but a living link to a wider world. Their conversations would have broadened their personal horizons, enriched their understanding of human diversity, and perhaps made them more cosmopolitan, more tolerant, and more astute in their dealings with foreigners of all kinds. This personal, unquantifiable influence, replicated across many such interactions, would have contributed to the unique character of Venetian society. Ultimately, Alessandro Carini's journey and its subsequent recording acted as a powerful dissolvent of parochialism. It demonstrated that Venice, for all its splendor and power, was part of a much larger, interconnected world. This realization, while perhaps initially unsettling, was also profoundly liberating. It opened up new possibilities for trade, for diplomacy, for intellectual exchange, and for adventure. It reminded Venetians and eventually Europeans that their world was not the only world, and that much remained to be discovered, understood, and learned from others. The enduring legacy was a call to curiosity, an invitation to explore not just the physical globe, but the vast and varied landscapes of human experience. Alessandro had been a merchant's son, an emissary, a prisoner, and a scholar, but his most lasting role was that of a bridge builder, connecting disparate parts of humanity through the power of observed experience and the enduring magic of a well-told story. The influence of Alessandro Carini's narrative extended into the realm of Venetian self-perception. For a republic that built its identity on maritime prowess, mercantile acumen, and a fiercely guarded independence, Alessandro's story added another layer, that of the intrepid explorer, the citizen capable of navigating not just the seas but also the complex courts of distant and powerful empires. He became a figure who embodied Venetian resilience, adaptability, and an unquenchable thirst for knowledge of the world. This wasn't just about individual glory. It subtly reinforced the idea of Venice as a city uniquely positioned and equipped to engage with the farthest corners of the earth. Consider the training of young Venetian diplomats and merchants. While they would still learn the traditional arts of negotiation, accounting, and navigation, the Carini manuscript, even in its restricted forms, would have become essential, if unofficial, reading. It offered insights into cultural sensitivities, political hierarchies, and economic systems vastly different from their own. A young man preparing for a voyage to the Black Sea, or a diplomatic mission to the Mamluk court in Egypt, might study Alessandro's descriptions of Mongol court etiquette or their methods of taxation, not to directly apply them, but to broaden his understanding of how other powerful states operated, making him a more effective and adaptable representative of the Republic. The descriptions of the Great Khan's immense wealth and the vast resources of Cathay also had a long-term effect on Venetian economic strategy. While direct trade was immensely difficult and controlled by many intermediaries, the knowledge of this ultimate source fueled a persistent desire to find more direct routes or to secure more favorable terms with those intermediaries. It raised the stakes. The profits to be made from the Eastern trade were clearly far greater than previously imagined, if one could only get closer to the origin. This provided a constant impetus for Venetian merchants to push the boundaries of their existing networks, to seek out new contacts and to take greater risks in pursuit of these fabled riches. Furthermore, Alessandro's account of the relative peace and order, the Pax Mongolica, that existed across vast stretches of Asia under Kublai Khan's rule during its peak was a revelation. For Europeans accustomed to frequent local wars and the dangers of travel even within their own continent, the idea of being able to traverse thousands of miles with a reasonable degree of safety under the aegis of a single, powerful authority was astonishing. While this peace was enforced by a formidable military power, it nonetheless highlighted the benefits of centralized control for facilitating trade and communication on a grand scale. This might have led some Venetian thinkers to reflect on the costs of European disunity and the potential benefits of greater cooperation, at least in commercial spheres. The sheer existence of a figure like Kublai Khan, as depicted by Alessandro, a ruler of immense power, yet also possessed of intellectual curiosity and a degree of religious tolerance, challenged European stereotypes of Oriental despots. It presented a more complex picture of leadership and empire in the East, suggesting that power could be wielded with sophistication and a degree of enlightenment, not just brute force. This nuanced portrayal, even if filtered through Alessandro's Venetian perspective, contributed to a more mature understanding of global politics. Alessandro's personal journey, from a youth accompanying his father and uncle into the unknown, to a trusted emissary of the Khan, to a prisoner dictating his memoirs, and finally to a revered, if sometimes doubted, sage in his own city, also offered a powerful narrative of individual resilience and the transformative potential of travel. Alessandro's personal journey, from a youth accompanying his father and uncle into the unknown, to a trusted emissary of the Khan, to a prisoner dictating his memoirs, and finally to a revered, if sometimes doubted, sage in his own city, also offered a frayed. His story was a testament to the idea that one's origins did not necessarily define one's destiny, and that profound personal growth could come from immersing oneself in cultures vastly different from one's own. This was an inspiring message for a city like Venice, which, despite its established patriciate, also valued individual initiative and daring. In the end, the most enduring legacy of Alessandro Querini was perhaps the most intangible. He made the world feel both larger and more connected. Larger, because he unveiled the true scale and complexity of civilizations that had previously been mere names or legends. More connected, because he demonstrated through his own life and the story he told that these distant worlds were not entirely alien, that bridges of understanding could be built, and that humanity, for all its diverse expressions, shared common curiosities, ambitions, and vulnerabilities. His manuscript was not just a description of the world. It was an invitation to engage with it, an invitation that Venice, and indeed Europe, would spend the next several centuries responding to, often with Alessandro Querini's words as their initial guide. The Querini manuscript also subtly influenced the Venetian understanding of value. Alessandro's descriptions of Cathay's sophisticated use of paper money, backed by the Khan's authority and accepted across vast swathes of his empire, was a concept that took a long time for bullion-based European economies to fully grasp. However, the mere fact that such a system existed and functioned on such a grand scale planted a seed. Venetian bankers, among the most innovative in Europe, might have begun to ponder more abstract forms of credit and representation of wealth, moving beyond the physical limitations of gold and silver. While the full development of fiat currency was centuries away, Alessandro's account provided an early, real-world example that challenged existing financial paradigms. It suggested that trust and authority could, under certain circumstances, underpin value as effectively as precious metal. Moreover, his detailed lists of commodities, their places of origin, and the routes by which they travelled effectively provided Venice with an unprecedented market intelligence report. This knowledge, even when restricted, would have given Venetian negotiators an edge. When dealing with Alexandrian or Levantine merchants for spices from the Indies, Venetian traders armed with Querini's insights would have a clearer idea of the true source, the intermediate stages of trade, and potentially the markups involved. When dealing with Alexandrian or Levantine merchants for spices from the Indies, Venetian traders armed with Querini's insights would have a clearer idea of the true source, the intermediate stages of trade, and, potentially, the markups. This understanding could lead to harder bargaining and a more strategic approach to acquiring Eastern goods. Alessandro's personal character, as it emerged from his narrative and his conduct upon returning to Venice, also became part of his legacy. His quiet persistence in the face of skepticism, his dedication to factual accuracy, as he perceived it, and his lack of overt self-aggrandizement, despite the incredible nature of his experiences, lent a certain gravitas to his account. He wasn't portrayed as a swashbuckling adventurer in his own telling, but more as a diligent observer and a faithful servant of the Khan. This scholarly, almost detached persona ironically made his extraordinary tales more believable to serious thinkers than if he had presented them with flamboyant embellishments. It suggested a man more interested in truth than in personal fame. The impact on Venetian storytelling itself is also worth noting. While fantastical tales of the East already existed, Alessandro's work, with its grounding in observed reality and its detailed, systematic approach, provided a new model for travel literature. It showed that a true account of distant lands could be as compelling, if not more so, than purely imaginary voyages. This might have encouraged other Venetian travellers, merchants and diplomats to keep more detailed journals, to record their own observations with greater care, contributing to a growing body of European knowledge about the wider world. The standard for what constituted a credible travel account was subtly raised. Consider also the psychological preparation Alessandro's story provided for future encounters. When, in later centuries, Europeans began to have more direct and sustained contact with China and other Asian civilizations, the shock of cultural difference, while still significant, might have been marginally lessened for those familiar with Carini's descriptions. He had, in a sense, already introduced Europe to the idea of sophisticated, non-European civilizations with ancient traditions, complex social structures, and advanced technologies. This didn't prevent misunderstandings or conflicts, but it provided a pre-existing framework, a set of reference points that was not entirely blank. The very survival and continued study of Alessandro's manuscript, despite the initial doubts and the passage of time, underscores the enduring human fascination with exploration and discovery. His story tapped into a fundamental human desire to know what lies beyond the horizon, to understand the full scope of human experience and the diversity of the world. It was a narrative that spoke not just to Venetian commercial interests or strategic concerns, but to a deeper intellectual and spiritual curiosity. Ultimately, Alessandro Carini's legacy is a testament to the profound and lasting impact one individual's journey, when meticulously observed and faithfully recorded, can have on the collective consciousness of an era. He did not set out to be a hero or a world changer. He was a young Venetian caught up in extraordinary circumstances, who rose to the occasion with intelligence, resilience, and an insatiable curiosity. His gift to Venice and to the world was not just a map of distant lands, but a map of human possibility, a demonstration that the greatest treasures are often found not in gold or spices, but in the expansion of understanding and the bridging of disparate worlds through the power of shared experience. His gift to Venice and to the world was not just a map of distant lands, but a map of human possibility, a demonstration that the greatest treasures are often found not in gold or spices, but in the expansion of understanding and the bridging of disparate sides. The enduring fascination with Alessandro Carini's narrative, and its gradual acceptance as a substantially truthful account, also played a role in fostering a more global perspective within Venice's intellectual and ruling classes. For a city-state whose fortunes were so intimately tied to international trade, understanding the broader geopolitical landscape was crucial. Alessandro's manuscript provided an unparalleled view into the workings of the largest empire on earth, offering insights that were not just commercially valuable, but also strategically vital. The knowledge that such a power existed, with its vast resources and military capabilities, would have informed Venetian foreign policy, its alliances, and its assessment of threats and opportunities on a scale previously unconsidered. The very act of translating Alessandro's experiences, first from his mind into spoken words for Rustichello, then from Rustichello's Pisan-inflected French-Italian dialect into more formal Venetian and Latin for scholarly study, highlighted the challenges and importance of cross-cultural communication. Alessandro himself, having become fluent in several Eastern languages, embodied the ideal of the cosmopolitan Venetian, capable of navigating diverse cultural contexts. His success in the Khan's service was a testament to this adaptability. This would have subtly reinforced the value placed on linguistic skills and cultural sensitivity among those Venetians destined for careers in international trade or diplomacy. Learning the languages of one's trading partners or political rivals was not just a practical skill, but a strategic advantage, a lesson amplified by Carini's example. Moreover, Alessandro's descriptions of the Khan's patronage of arts and sciences, his employment of scholars and artisans from various cultures, would have resonated with the spirit of the burgeoning Renaissance in Italy. It presented a model of enlightened rule where intellectual and artistic pursuits were valued, even by a leader whose power was ultimately rooted in military conquest. This might have encouraged Venetian patrons to look beyond their own immediate traditions, to be more open to foreign influences and ideas, fostering the city's role as a vibrant cultural crossroads. The detailed nature of Alessandro's observations, from the specifics of salt production in Yunkai to the intricacies of pearl diving in the Indian Ocean, from the types of grains cultivated in different regions to the methods of constructing bridges, also provided a wealth of practical, if sometimes esoteric, knowledge. The detailed nature of Alessandro's observations, from the specifics of salt production in Yunkai to the intricacies of pearl diving in the Indian Ocean, from the types of grains cultivated in different regions to the methods of RAS. While not all of this information was immediately applicable in Venice, it contributed to a broader understanding of global resources, technologies, and environmental conditions. Such knowledge could inform decisions about potential new trade ventures, the sourcing of raw materials, or even adaptations to Venetian agriculture or engineering based on distant examples. The sheer narrative power of the description of the world also ensured its longevity. It was a story of adventure, of strange lands and exotic peoples, of immense wealth and imperial grandeur. It captivated the imagination in a way that dry commercial ledgers or diplomatic reports could not. This appeal ensured that it was copied, read, and discussed far beyond the immediate circle of Venetian strategists, embedding its vision of the East deep within the European consciousness. Even if some readers focused on the more fantastical elements, the underlying message of a vast, complex, and accessible, however arduously, East remained. Alessandro Quirini's story, therefore, became more than just the account of one man's travels. It became a lens through which Venice, and subsequently Europe, viewed a significant portion of the world for centuries. It shaped ambitions, informed strategies, sparked curiosity, and subtly altered the intellectual and cultural landscape. He had ventured into the unknown, and returned not just with tales of marvels, but with a framework for understanding a previously unimaginable reality. His legacy was not carved in stone, but written on parchment, and more importantly imprinted on the minds of generations who followed, forever expanding their sense of what the world contained and what was possible within it. The journey from a curious boy in a Venice longing for his absent father to the wise elder whose words redrew maps and reshaped understanding was in itself a testament to the transformative power of engaging with the other, and the enduring strength of a meticulously recorded truth. The enduring impact of Alessandro Quirini's work can also be seen in the way it fueled the image of the East in the European mind. While this image was often a complex mixture of fact, fantasy, and projection, Quirini's detailed and largely sober account provided a substantial anchor of reality. Before him, the East was often a land of monstrous races and mythical kingdoms, derived from classical sources or vague travellers' tales. Alessandro replaced these chimeras with concrete descriptions of cities like Kunbalik and Zaitun, with accounts of a functioning imperial bureaucracy, with observations of real peoples and their customs. This did not entirely dispel the exoticism. Indeed, the reality was often exotic enough, but it grounded the European conception of Asia in a more tangible framework. This more grounded understanding, however, did not preclude a sense of wonder. In fact, Alessandro's descriptions of the sheer scale of the Mongol Empire, the opulence of Kublai Khan's court, the advanced nature of certain technologies like paper money and coal usage, and the vast distances involved, were arguably more wondrous than any mythical beast. It was the wonder of a real, functioning, and immensely powerful alternative civilization that captivated his readers. This sense of a real but vastly different East spurred a desire not just to imagine it, but to reach it, to trade with it, and perhaps for some, to emulate aspects of its success. The challenges Alessandro faced in having his account believed also served as a cautionary tale about the limits of parochialism and the difficulty of conveying experiences that lie far outside the recipient's frame of reference. His struggle was a testament to the inertia of established worldviews. Yet the eventual, albeit gradual, acceptance of much of his testimony also demonstrated the power of persistent, detailed evidence. It highlighted the importance of credibility, of meticulous observation, and of finding a voice, like Rusticello's, capable of translating extraordinary experiences into a comprehensible narrative. Consider the development of cartography. Fra Mauro's Mappa Mundi, so heavily influenced by Alessandro, was not just a Venetian achievement, but a European one. Copies and derivatives of it, incorporating Quirini's data, spread throughout the continent, providing navigators, scholars, and rulers with a vastly improved understanding of Asian geography. This improved cartographic knowledge was a direct prerequisite for the age of exploration. Without a more accurate map of the East, the voyages of Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and others would have been based on even greater speculation and misinformation. Alessandro's 17 years of travel, condensed into his manuscript, thus had a direct practical impact on the ability of Europeans to navigate and conceptualize their world. The very act of Venice preserving and studying Alessandro's account, even with its initial secrecy and skepticism, demonstrates the city's pragmatic recognition of the value of information. In a world where knowledge was power, Alessandro's experiences represented a significant intelligence asset. This pragmatic approach to information gathering and analysis was a hallmark of Venetian statecraft and contributed to its long-standing success as a commercial and maritime power. Alessandro, in this sense, was an unwitting but highly effective intelligence agent for his republic. His story also serves as a timeless reminder of the individual's potential to contribute to collective knowledge. Alessandro was not a king or a great general. He was, initially, a young man with a keen mind and a willingness to observe. His unique circumstances placed him in a position to witness extraordinary things, but it was his personal qualities, his curiosity, his adaptability, his linguistic skills, and his dedication to recording his experiences that transformed those circumstances into a lasting legacy. This is an inspiring aspect of his narrative, suggesting that significant contributions to human understanding can come from unexpected quarters. In the centuries that followed, as Europe's engagement with Asia intensified, Alessandro Quirini's The Description of the World remained a crucial reference point. It was compared with the accounts of later travellers, debated by historians and cited by geographers. Its influence was not static. It evolved as new information became available, sometimes confirming his observations, sometimes offering corrections or new perspectives. But it always remained a foundational text, a testament to one of the earliest and most comprehensive Western encounters with the civilizations of the Far East. His journey was a singular thread, but it became woven into the vast and complex tapestry of East-West relations, its colours still visible long after the weaver himself was gone. The legacy of Alessandro Quirini also underscores the vital role of the intermediary or translator in cross-cultural understanding, not just in language, but in concepts and worldviews. Alessandro himself served as this intermediary between the Mongol East and the Venetian West. His ability to learn local languages, understand different social etiquettes, and interpret the Khan's intentions made him effective in the East. Upon his return, his collaboration with Rustichello da Pisa was another act of translation, transforming lived experience and memory into a structured, accessible narrative for a European audience. Fra Mauro, in turn, translated Alessandro's verbal descriptions and sketches into the visual language of maps. This chain of translation was essential for the dissemination and impact of his knowledge. This highlights a crucial aspect of the enduring legacy of recorded experience. The experience itself, however profound, remains inert without the means to communicate it effectively to others. Alessandro's story might have died with him, or remained a collection of disjointed anecdotes, had it not been for the act of recording and the subsequent efforts to interpret, copy, and disseminate that record. The Quirini manuscript, therefore, is as much a testament to the power of writing and cartography as it is to the journey itself. Consider the subtle ways Alessandro's account might have influenced Venetian art beyond mere motifs. His descriptions of the vast, ordered landscapes of the Mongol Empire, the grandeur of Khan Balik with its grid-like streets and sprawling palace grounds, might have offered a different aesthetic ideal compared to Venice's intricate, organic, and somewhat chaotic beauty. While Venetian painters would continue to celebrate their unique cityscape, the awareness of alternative forms of urban design and imperial splendor could have broadened their artistic palette, influencing their depiction of perspective, scale, and composition in imaginative or historical scenes. While Venetian painters would continue to celebrate their unique cityscape, the awareness of alternative forms of urban design and imperial splendor could have broadened their artistic palette, influencing their depiction of perspective, scale, and composition in imaginative ordeal. The very notion of travel literature as a genre was advanced by Alessandro's work. While earlier accounts of pilgrimages or limited voyages existed, the comprehensive scope, detailed observations, and narrative coherence of the description of the world set a new standard. It demonstrated that a journey could be the basis for a significant work of scholarship and literature, one that could both inform and entertain. This would inspire other literate travelers in subsequent generations to document their own experiences with greater care and ambition, contributing to a growing European corpus of knowledge about the non-European world. Alessandro's personal transformation, though not the central focus of his manuscript, which aimed for a more objective description, is an implicit theme. The young man who left Venice, driven by a mixture of filial duty and youthful curiosity, returned 17 years later, a seasoned observer of empires, a linguist, a diplomat of sorts, and a repository of unparalleled geographical and cultural knowledge. This journey undoubtedly changed him profoundly, broadening his perspectives, tempering his Venetian assumptions, and giving him a unique understanding of human diversity and imperial power. This personal growth, even if only hinted at, adds another layer to his story, making him a more relatable and compelling figure. Finally, the persistence of doubt surrounding Alessandro's account, even centuries later, speaks to a fundamental human tendency to resist information that dramatically challenges pre-existing worldviews. His tales were so extraordinary, the scale of the Mongol Empire so vast, that they seemed to defy belief. This skepticism, while frustrating for Alessandro and later historians, also served a purpose. It prompted closer scrutiny, more rigorous analysis, and a continuous effort to verify or contextualize his claims. In a way, the doubts ensured that his manuscript was not simply accepted uncritically, but became a subject of ongoing scholarly engagement, keeping its contents alive and relevant. In the grand sweep of history, Alessandro Querini stands as a pivotal figure, not for battles won or empires built, but for the knowledge he painstakingly gathered and bequeathed to posterity. His journey was a monumental feat of endurance and observation. His manuscript was a monumental act of testimony. Together they irrevocably expanded the horizons of his time, demonstrating that the world was far more interconnected and far more wondrous than previously conceived. The transformative power of his cross-cultural encounter, amplified and preserved through the enduring legacy of his recorded experience, continued to shape the course of exploration, trade, and understanding for centuries, a quiet but profound current in the stream of human history. The narrative of Alessandro Querini, filtering through the centuries, ultimately contributed to a more mature and complex European self-awareness. By holding up a mirror to the vast and sophisticated civilizations of the East, his account implicitly forced Europeans to re-evaluate their own position in the world. The assumption of automatic cultural or technological superiority, common in many societies, was subtly challenged by his descriptions of Mongol administrative efficiency, Chinese innovations, and the sheer scale of Eastern cities and populations. This did not necessarily lead to humility, but it did introduce a degree of relativity, an understanding that other powerful and highly developed human societies existed with different, yet often effective, ways of organizing themselves and interacting with the world. This comparative perspective was invaluable. For instance, Alessandro's descriptions of the religious tolerance practiced within Kublai Khan's empire, where various faiths were allowed to coexist, as long as they did not challenge Mongol authority, offered a striking contrast to the often violent religious conflicts and persecutions that characterized much of European history. While not a direct model for emulation, it provided an example of a different approach to managing religious diversity within a large state, prompting reflection among some European thinkers about the relationship between state power and religious freedom. The long-term economic impact, beyond immediate trade intelligence, was also significant. Alessandro's detailed inventories of Eastern products, from fine silks and porcelains to exotic spices and medicinal herbs, not only fueled European desire for these goods, but also gradually led to attempts to replicate or find substitutes for them. The desire for Chinese porcelain, for example, spurred centuries of European experimentation to discover the secrets of its manufacture. Similarly, the knowledge of Eastern agricultural products could eventually lead to the transplantation of certain crops or the search for new lands where they might be cultivated, all part of a broader economic response to the riches Querini had described. His story also became a touchstone for the concept of discovery itself. While Alessandro did not discover Cathay in the sense of revealing an unknown land to its inhabitants, he unveiled it to Europe in an unprecedented way. His journey became emblematic of the courage required to venture into the unknown, the diligence needed to observe and record, and the intellectual honesty to report findings even when they were difficult to believe. This ideal of the explorer-scholar influenced subsequent generations of travellers and scientists, shaping the ethos of European exploration. The very endurance of Il Milione through countless manuscript copies, and later the advent of printing, speaks to its fundamental human appeal. It is a story of adventure, of encountering the other, of personal transformation, and of bringing back knowledge that has the power to change one's own society. These are timeless themes that resonate across cultures and generations. Alessandro's journey, though rooted in the specific historical context of the 13th century, thus acquired a universal quality, becoming part of the shared human heritage of exploration and discovery. In the final analysis, Alessandro Querini's most profound legacy was the intellectual ferment his account generated. By providing a wealth of new, often startling, information about a vast and previously little understood part of the world, he compelled Europeans to think, to question, to compare, and to imagine. His manuscript was not a static collection of facts, but a catalyst for ongoing inquiry and debate. It challenged existing geographical, historical, theological, and economic assumptions, forcing a re-evaluation of Europe's place in the global order. This process of intellectual readjustment, slow and often contentious, was essential for Europe's transition from the medieval to the early modern period. Alessandro Querini, the Venetian traveller, through the power of his observed and recorded experience, played a small but crucial role in that monumental transformation. His voice echoing down the centuries, a testament to the enduring power of knowledge to reshape the world.